Okay, let's turn to the stalker herself, Martha, where she comes in when it comes to trauma and resilience.
I mean, her behavior was incredibly self-sabotaging.
Hello and welcome to the Write the Book Inside You podcast. Stay tuned for an exciting episode with Sally Baker, the author of The Getting of Resilience from the Inside Out, where we'll not only be looking at resilience in terms of your own life, but also when it comes to Prince Harry leaving the royal family as described in his biography Spare, and Richard Gadd, creator of the Netflix stalking sensation Baby Reindeer. Hello and welcome to the Write the Book Inside You podcast. Tips, tools and interviews for coaches and healers like you who want to write a non-fiction book to boost your visibility, clients and cash flow while making a difference. I'm your host, Caryl Westmore, a multi-published author and energy psychology tapping book coach. Now let's jump into today's episode. Sally Baker is a senior, licensed and accredited full-time therapist specializing in working with people who feel broken or stuck. London-based for more than 20 years, Sally has helped countless clients release their inner blocks using techniques like hypnosis, EFT, emotional freedom techniques, and other related therapies. She has also become a popular media commentator on television and in the press on topics as varied as Love Island, mental health and well-being, and various celebrities in the news, which we're going to touch on today. We are focusing on a specific aspect of life today, how to bounce back from adversity and unpredictable traumas, something called resilience. Welcome, Sally.
Thank you, Caryl. Thanks for having me.
Sally, in your new book, The Getting of Resilience from the Inside Out, you seem to suggest that we'll get through life's dramas and unexpected traumas dependent on things we learned as kids, how we were treated, how we coped, or incidents that happened, resulting as adults in things like resilience with self-worth, self-belief, and compassion.
Yeah.
That's the ideal situation. But as you know from your own life, and maybe it's with one of the drivers to your purpose, helping others, is that these things can linger, affecting us for many years. Sally, please share with us the triggering events that you suffered that lingered with you for many years until you found a way to heal it.
So when I was 7, something terrible happened to me that involved 2 much older boys that sexually abused me. I didn't really understand what had happened to me. I didn't have any language to explain it or to relate it. And then one day my mother said, oh, by the way, we're going back to this household where these boys lived. I became hysterical. And told my mom what had happened to me. And my mom said, never speak of this again. Don't tell anyone. Just don't mention it. And she was very, very firm about that. And I just immediately believed that I'd done something wrong and what happened to me had been my fault. So that changed the course of my life for a very long time. And it wasn't resolved until I was 35. And I had a follow-up conversation about those events with my mother. But a lot of water had got under the bridge by then.
So Sally, the effect of childhood trauma like that, and it's very common, apparently 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 boys
absolutely
suffer this according to the statistics. So Sally, the effect of this trauma on your life and of any young child lingers, as they say, feelings buried alive never die, or memories buried alive never die. And why is it that the younger we are, perhaps, or in our early years, we are so influenced by seeming sometimes big and sometimes small traumas that stay with us and affect our well-being and mental health?
Because we make judgments about what happened to us. So that's what I see. That's the link I make with my work with clients. So I see clients where, just like me, horrible, terrible things happen to them. That's bad enough. No amount of therapy is ever going to stop bad things happening to people. But what is often much more enduring are the judgments those people made about themselves following those events. So in my case, the self-judgment I made about myself was it was all my fault and I was to blame. And that's a very common response from survivors of childhood sexual abuse or adverse childhood situations. that it's our fault, and that affects our self-belief, our self-esteem, our self-worth. It affects our ability to feel like we have a role to play in life as adults, all the way through to adulthood.
So your relationships, your career, everything
absolutely
can be under a cloud that you don't realize. And what I've come to understand, and you mentioned Bessel van der Kolk in the book and many trauma therapists today, that a triggering event in the present can re-agitate something
absolutely.
from the past that's lying dormant. Can you maybe tell us about a client's story where that happened?
So I had a client, a photographer who was very adventurous, solo traveler, been all around the world several times. At the top of her profession, she went to photograph some caves in China. Had to go down sort of like, rickety rope ladder type effect. All of that was she could manage all of that. But when it came to this one staircase where she couldn't see the bottom of the staircase, she had her first ever panic attack, complete meltdown, and couldn't traverse this stairway. But she didn't know why it happened. So we unpicked it during our therapeutic process and found out that when she was a child, every morning she would wake up early before her mother and to go downstairs and to check on her father, who was an alcoholic. And she never knew what state she was going to find her father in. Sometimes it was covered in vomit. Sometimes it was, he'd hit his head and was covered in blood, all sorts of terrible things. And she would be faced at the top of the stairs with this dark hallway and the trepidation of not knowing what she was going to find at the bottom of the stairs. And that experience of hers in China in the caves had brought that all back up to the fore. So that's just an example of how memories buried alive never die.
Exactly, and how something can trigger it. But to bring it full circle with her case, how would you address, the awareness is the first thing.
Sure.
What is a way to permanently make sure that these panic attacks abate? What are some of the therapies you use?
You have to clear the issue. You have to resolve the trauma. It's not enough just to have intellectual knowledge about, oh gosh, this terrible thing happened to me. It's sort of helpful. Sometimes people never find the initiatizing event. They never really find it. They're haunted by the why. Why am I like this? And getting caught up in the why isn't that helpful. What we need to do is resolve whatever is driving the behavior, the trigger. And the trigger you can work on it in the present day, or you can track it back to the initiatizing event if people are able to find it. The techniques I use, I often start with EFT, emotional freedom technique, because it's a great way of moving people from their front analytical daytime brain to being more intuitive, to being more meditative. And I also use the Orpheus Mind Technologies, which is now an app, which is amazing. And that's based on the old PS Tech.
Third one?
EFT and hypnosis. But again, hypnosis, the other word for hypnosis is suggestion technique. So it's not enough just to go straight to hypnosis. You really need to clear the crud first.
Correct.
And then, you can overlay with lots of positive affirmation and build up a stronger core. But you can't just overlay that when things are still separating and raw.
I think what we found out with latest neuroscience is you actually re-imprinting the old neuro pathways in the brain.
And I can do that with BWRT as well, which brainwave recursive therapy, which is amazing for dealing with trauma.
That lingers.
Yes.
There's one that to bring it round to a well-known person, Prince Harry.
Yes.
Mentioned as EMDR. Now we're going to talk a little bit more on this.
Interesting.
Of resilience. But I saw a video, or I think he went on one of the America to launch his book, saying that this had helped him, and he even showed, this. You probably aren't necessarily an EMDR expert, although we use it, as you know, in EFT.
Sure.
We do some eye movement.
Yeah.
So what would you say is happening in the world where Prince Harry can come out and say that this helped him with? Can you recall?
Of his mother's death, when his father came to his bedroom that night and touched him on the knee, but didn't hold him or hug him, and then left him alone again. So with the news that his mom had died in that car crash. But the interesting thing about EMDR, I'm not an EMDR therapist, but I often see clients who come to me and the first thing they say is, I failed at EMDR.
Really?
Now, the thing about EMDR is that you need to forensically go through what happened to you.
So what is interesting when we look at Bessel van der Kolk, who you mentioned in your book, because his book, The Body Keeps the Score, which is what we're saying.
Yes.
The important thing is that he says he doesn't use the word horses for courses, but they're different therapies that you would use EMDR on that you wouldn't perhaps use with, say, children in an orphanage. They are different. He mentions different ones, not necessarily the ones you use in your book, but I think he says yoga and, they're
breathing, breath work
and psychedelic. And, so we just, the important thing that we found is that talk therapy did not have the answers for you and me and for our clients. And even though we were perhaps ahead of our time in the last 20 years, if I speak for myself, it has come round. Dr. Peter Stapleton, as Bessel van der Kolk says, we might be exploring something and then we can do scientific validation. And that's what Dr. Peter Stapleton has done in Australia with eating disorders. She didn't believe in it. She didn't know what was happening with tapping. And then she began to do the scientific validation as best she could. So, those are all amazing things that you do mention in your book on resilience. But let's go back to Prince Harry. Here is an example of someone doing his best to come out and say, I have had therapy or I'm having therapy. And yet, what would you say about the main events in his life that he reveals in Spare? What does it show about someone trying to cope with resilience or lack of?
I think what he does is something that lots of celebrities do when they mention mental health. And what they do is they try to tie it in saying, I had this one incident that caused me mental anguish and I resolved it in this way. So celebrities often want to talk about mental health in isolation around certain events, life events that triggered them. And they want to talk about it in the past tense, when in reality, mental well-being is something that we manage every day. Every day. So I understand why actors want to tell you, well, yes, I had this episode of great anxiety or emotional anguish in the past. It's gone now. I'm over it. I did some work. I did some therapy, because we live in a time of huge disclosure, but it's done. And that feels to me overly tidy, because in my work and in my life, I recognize that, it's layers of an onion. And we need to manage our mental well-being, and we need to be like ninja warriors in training, so that, we need good nutrition, we need proper sleep, we need to stay away from alcohol and Class A drugs as much as possible or completely. And we need to recognize when our mental health is slipping and think, actually, I need to rest more, or I need to lean in and find out what's going on. I don't need things like toxic positivity. I don't need to be in denial, and I don't need to just say, oh, it happened to me once and, I've been mentally well ever since, because that's not how mental well-being
works. Now for a word from our episode sponsor. Every writer has faced the dreaded writer's block. But what if you had not just one, but 7 ways to shatter it? Introducing Bust Writer's Block Forever, 7 game-changing ways to kiss writer's block goodbye and unleash creative inspiration. Dive deep into transformative processes, the work of Byron Katie, Havening, EFT tapping, the journey, the alter ego effect for writers, internal family systems. And as a special treat, a bonus chapter on collaborating, even dancing with ChatGPT, your new creative catalyst. For those who've been inspired by The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron, this book and accompanying video course at bustwritersblock.com will feel like coming home. Dive in at bustwritersblock.com. Now back to today's episode.
Let's go to what Prince Harry talks about in Spare, sibling rivalry.
Right.
It's a very common thing. And I've found in my work, it isn't always, you can get really disturbing older siblings or siblings who do as much damage as a parent could.
Absolutely.
And yet you can get some events which were just one child got something and the other made a decision that they said, I had to finish my spinach, and they got their pudding, and that means they don't love me.
Sure.
But in Princess Harry's case, we see him coming out with incidents about his brother,
Yes.
and how he was being hurt. And yet at the end saying, but I'm willing to forgive it all. Now, what do you think is really going on there? Because it doesn't seem necessarily that the royal family and the older brother think it's okay to come out and said those things. Where do you think that leaves someone like Prince Harry trying to,
make
cope
peace
with this, make
peace with what's happened to him? Harry, to me, behaves like someone who still has live trauma because he burns bridges on a regular basis. And he acts quite often impetuously, distresses lots of people, and then somehow quite unrealistically expects people to get over it. I mean, what we've just had, bringing the Harry and royal family right up to date, is, Harry came back from the States. His father's recovering from cancer, and his father couldn't find the time to see him because his father's still absolutely furious with him. So there we have the prodigal son, and the story of Harry and William and his father becomes more and more biblical by the day. Prodigal son returns and is rebuffed. There's no room for him. There's no invitation for him to come and even have afternoon tea with his dad. And for me, the king is the adult in the room, and I feel he should have accepted his son and had him back.
So we all have our ideas. And I believe that reactivity, because now we don't want to analyze King Charles, but even his childhood could have left him wounded with the inability to cope with that kind of hurt that his son seems to be interpreting. So to just move actually from King Charles to just any child who doesn't have that loving, supportive care when they're going through something like a horrific boarding school experience, which we know, King Charles did have. Will linger without that unless they do their reparenting. That's how I see it. Now, I'm not talking about them. How do you feel? We need to find a way where we're not exposed to the trauma of our past, but not necessarily by following a YouTube video or just trying to do it on our own, because we need the support of others or of a therapist. Would you agree with that? That's ultimately the way to become resilient, is asking for help when you need it.
I think, for instance, the self-help book, and sometimes it's called shelf help because, there are a lot of self-help books out there. If we could do it all from a book, if we could do our own root canal work, we wouldn't need to go to the dentist. And when you're in it, it's very difficult to see all of the nuances of it. So often clients have done a lot of their own work before they come and see me, and they have a fair amount of understanding of what their dynamics are, what their past are, and what their triggers are. And they say, oh yeah, it's about this, this, and this. But often I find it their omissions. So people tell you their truth by what they say, their commission, and they tell you their truth by what they omit, their omissions. So if I say, okay, you've told me a lot about your mother, where's your father in all of this? And they go, oh, you're right, my dad. So, sometimes it takes a fresh eye just to look through someone else's neck curtains and go and work out what's happening for them. But when you're in it, when you're too close to it, when you've lived it, it's very difficult to do that on your own.
Very much a case of trauma.
Yeah.
I think sometimes we've either forgotten, buried it, or we think we've dealt with it, or we were alone at the time. That isolation and aloneness needs to have a caring other listening and maybe doing some of the tools that will help you release the stuckness in your neural pathways and in your body. Turning to another topic of the day, baby reindeer. I'm sure there's quite a lot of grist for you to comment on the causes and the maybe the lack of resilience that he reveals in being stalked.
Incredibly accurate how he portrayed a survivor of abuse. It was alluded to in the program that he was sexually abused, not just by that man, but earlier in his life, and that had confused him. And one only has to think about how one's sexuality would have developed if one hadn't been gazumped in childhood. If one had been in control of one's own kind of sexual journey at one's own pace and not having it stolen from it. His portrayal of self-blame, guilt and shame and the self-loathing that he felt that killed any chance of him being loved or being open to anyone who could love him properly left him really isolated. And that's why I think he got sucked in when that woman was paying him attention, because attention's like grooming for vulnerable people. and attention is like love. So often sexual abuse doesn't happen as a violent act. I mean, clearly it does for very many people, but their grooming is another word for seduction. And I think she seduced him with paying him vast amounts of attention, inordinate amounts of attention over a period of weeks. Yeah. And he was quite needy, wasn't he?
Yes, and these are all things he reveals, but not necessarily with an awareness that, or do you think he did? Did he show quite a bit of self-awareness?
No, I don't think he did show a great deal of self-awareness. And I think everything he did, the reckless sexual behavior that he did with the other guy, with the man that hasn't been identified, hypersexualized behavior is really very common with survivors of sexual abuse.
So what I hear you saying is, although it doesn't come out in the show, it's very likely, although you said he mentions it, I missed that, there's earlier events in his life. And whenever whenever as adults, we're faced with traumas that we can't seem to feel resilient about, that's the time to take the timeline and go back and say,
absolutely.
I always say to clients, is there been another time when you felt like this before?
Yes.
And you go back in time and say, oh, yeah, my teacher, the way she talked to me, because I deal with people who found trouble writing their books. And so there can be these traumas that aren't as violent as sexual abuse, but they stick. They can stick. And what we're saying in this case is that there's possibly other levels that he needs to look into if he was your client.
Because his father, who disclosed to him during that program that he'd been sexually abused by someone in the Catholic Church, didn't he? Yes. And his father was very non-tactile. And the scene where he hugged his son felt like that's the first time he'd ever risked physical contact with his child. So you can imagine that the young Richard Gadd, who wrote it, and it was based on his life, supposedly, had never been held or had that physical reassurance from his father.
Yes.
So he would have been looking for that somewhere else.
Okay, let's turn to the stalker herself, Martha, where she comes in when it comes to trauma and resilience.
I mean, her behavior was incredibly self-sabotaging. It left her open to all sorts of trouble and potential exploitation. She had a compulsive disorder that she felt compelled. And also she had a history. This is a familiar practice of hers. She'd done this supposedly before. So this was a pattern of behavior that she acted out till it ran its course and probably ended, but always in cataclysmic circumstances. And then she would move on to the next person. And that was her pattern. And while she's engaged with this level of compulsive behavior and stalking, it's a huge distraction. What would she have to look at? What would she have to address if she wasn't completely monofocused on stalking someone? It shows up in so many different ways. You can have compulsive behavior around food. We know that, but you can do it around shopping or gambling online or anything, or doom scrolling. It's just, what would you have to look at if you didn't have that to distract you? And often people would have to look at the paucity and the loneliness of their own life.
So can you give us 3 important ways that if someone's listening and thinking, well, I do feel lonely a lot of the time, and I haven't really done any therapy to delve into some things I think I remember happening to me. What are some of the ways we could begin and continue?
Yeah, I think one of the most important ways to begin is start to have some insights into the negative voice that's inside our head. That's the negative voice that runs a commentary on everything we say and everything we do. And when I say that to my clients, they go, sure, I haven't got one. And they look up, and that's their inner voice commenting. So everyone has an inner voice. And often it's quite a toxic inner voice. It's like a drip that happens just below conscious awareness. So it's really good to start checking in with that inner voice and thinking, well, whose voice is that? Whose idiom, whose slang, what accent are they speaking to me in? It's not even my voice. And start to interrupt it. And there are lots of different ways you can interrupt it. I like the game show noise where you get the answer wrong. So if you're in company, you just go, I'm having another negative thought. And, if you're on your own, you can out loud, just say it out loud. Just interrupt that negative thought process, because it doesn't serve you. It's a toxic drip. So that's the inner voice. Another very early casualty of adverse childhood experiences is one's intuition, Because when we're children and we're powerless, that's what children are, and we realize that the situation isn't to our benefit, our intuition doesn't develop because we know that there's no point us knowing what's going on because we can't do anything about it. But as adults, we can increase our intuition, the power of our intuition, like you would a muscle. So just before you say yes to anything or, get involved with anyone's suggestions, you pause long enough to take a breath. Do I really want to do this? Check in with your intuition, check in with your gut reactions, your response. And the more you do that, the more you take time to acknowledge your intuition and build on it, the stronger your intuition will be. And it always works for your higher good. Also, deciding if when you're furious at a situation, just taking a breath, because when we're furious in any kind of heightened emotion, our breathing becomes really shallow. Take a breath or two and work out, is my response to this proportionate? Or am I being triggered by something from my past? Angry all the time.
Out. And I mean, yeah, it's very, I think in times in my life, I've been overreactive. It's only now that I understand that I hadn't cleared all the work I've done, with this inner directed work that we do.
Yeah.
I hadn't cleared some of those, maybe how I saw my father acting out angrily, things that I learned to manage. Yeah.
And they're maladaptions and they don't work in our favor.
Sally, who would you like to see read your book and where can they get it?
Yes. Oh, well, I'd like everyone to read my book who feels that they are not fulfilling their full potential, who feels that they've got some way on their life's journey, but they're self-sabotaging. A lot of the things that cropped up in Baby Reindeer was that self-sabotaging behavior. I see it all the time in clients. It's around money, it's around relationships, it's around wounded inner child. If you feel that you've gone so far on your path and you can't go any further on your own, look for some more insights in the book and see what direction your therapeutic work might need to go next, perhaps.
Okay, that's a good one. And where your website would have something about the book, would it?
Yep, my website's workingonthebody.com. The book is available worldwide via Amazon, and my publisher is Hammersmith Books.
So workingonthebody.com is where you can find Sally, her work, her book. Thank you, Sally. It was an interesting and valuable interview.
Thank you. Thanks for
joining me on today's podcast. Want a free gift to inspire you further on your book writing adventure? My free checklist, 5 book hook tips to kickstart your book writing journey, will help you get clarity on the key essentials to make your book a winner. Download it at writethebookinsideyou.com/free gift. The links are in the show notes. Until next time, a big virtual hug and keep writing.